Chapter 4 by Arthur Caplan is titled, "It is not morally acceptable to buy and sell organs for human transplantation." Now, he starts off the chapter with a discussion of the harsh reality of allowing markets in organs, namely trafficking of the poor. He talks about a rabbi in New York City who liked to refer to himself as a matchmaker. Unfortunately, what he was doing was pocketing about 150 grand per organ from purchasers for serving as a middleman in an organ trafficking scheme, taking advantage of poor folks from Syria who didn't speak English. Now, Caplan says, sadly, in most of the world, allowing financial incentives in kidneys means that trafficking, exploitation, disabling the sellers, and even killing is the reality. Now, studies estimate, he says, that nearly 10% of all kidneys transplanted around the world are trafficked, and sales can lead to behavior that goes beyond simply taking advantage of poverty to obtain a kidney. So people sometimes pretend to get married as a cover for buying a kidney, and most people do not defend trafficking as a solution to organ shortage for a number of reasons. However, even if you admit that trafficking is a reprehensible response to scarcity, why does trafficking persist? And Caplan asks, is it possible to create systems using financial incentives to obtain kidneys that would not degenerate into trafficking? In his section on scarcity, Caplan talks about how every day many people die waiting for transplants, and many more await transplants suffering severe disability while they wait. He points out that scarcity is growing worse every year, and scarcity is actually a worse problem than it appears to be published from data on demand. In his section on duties to those in need and duties to those who might supply an organ, he points out that intentional ignorance about how an organ was obtained, from a scheduled execution of a prisoner or an organ that has been trafficked, is not an acceptable ethical excuse on the part of transplant teams and hospitals. And so he considers this question. When you look at the merits of proposals for inducing people to sell organs, which basically amounts to a strategy that's only applicable to kidneys, it is necessary to understand fully the bioethical framework that's guided organ and tissue donation since the solid organ transplants beginning in the 1950s. So then, in his section on the prevailing ethical framework for obtaining tissues and organs, Caplan talks about four key values. First, respect for persons. Second, the autonomy of the individual. Third, voluntary consent, and fourth, altruism. I'd like to highlight the focus about how a core element of the existing ethical framework that governs the procurement of organs and tissues, according to Caplan, is that the body and its parts not be made the object of commerce. Now, this is relevant not just to slavery and prostitution, which he talks about, but to organ transplantation. As he puts it, respect for the inherent dignity of human beings requires that they not be bought and sold. Now, proposals, therefore, he says, to increase the supply of organs must be very carefully weighed against this prevailing ethical framework, since the framework is widely known, heavily promoted, and has long served to protect the interests of prospective donors. When Caplan discusses ways of increasing the supply of organs, he talks a little bit about the history of how people have tried to increase the supply, including so-called required consent laws and donor cards. And then he points out that two basic strategies have recently been proposed to provide incentives for people to sell their organs upon their death. One is to allow persons to broker contracts while alive with persons interested in selling at prices mutually agreed upon by both parties. And another strategy is a regulated market, in which the government would act as the purchaser of organs, setting a fixed price and enforcing the conditions of sale. So, what's the trouble with markets and kidneys? Well, one criticism, he says, is that only the poor and desperate will want to sell their body parts. It's not likely that people who are very wealthy will be interested, he thinks. Now, a different argument is that selling organs, even in a tightly regulated market, violates the existing bioethical framework of respect for persons, since the sale is clearly being driven by profit. Now, interestingly, a parallel argument is that the core ethical norm of the medical profession is the principle, do no harm. He says the only way that removing an organ from someone seems morally defensible is if the donor chooses to undergo the harm of surgery solely to help another, not to make money. As he puts it, in a market, even a regulated market, doctors and nurses still would be using their skills to help living people harm themselves solely for money. And also, think about what would happen if people were afraid about a cadaver market with profit, where families and patients who were uncertain about the degree to which appropriate care was being offered and continued, if a person might be deemed by healthcare workers or greedy relatives worth more dead than alive. Caplan writes that there's a better option, default to donation. He says, following public opinion polls that show majority support for organ donation, instead of asking people to opt in to the donation of their organs, the laws in these nations ask those who do not wish to donate to opt out. A better description, he says, of this presumed consent is, quote, default to donation. Unlike the hypothetical and unsupported assertions of advocates of financial incentives and markets, Caplan claims that there will be interest in sale in rich nations or the ability to control trafficking in poor ones. Default to donation has produced results. He claims that one of the most important things about this strategy is that it's completely consistent with the existing long-standing bioethical framework of voluntary altruism governing organ and tissue procurement. Finally, in his conclusion, after recasting the argument he's made in the paper, Caplan recognizes that in the long run, bioengineering organs is the answer to shortage. But in the short run, trying to protect the existing system by not drastically deviating from the core values is what is best for helping those